Kosovo, Bosnia, Chechnya. Since the end of the Cold War, Europe has become a bloody place. In the Balkans and in the Caucasus, ethnic war has become a way of life. Many of these conflicts could have been prevented, but one of the very few people actually doing preventive diplomacy is a 75-year-old Dutch elder statesman, Max van der Stoel. In 1992, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, named him their High Commissioner on National Minorities. His job, to stop ethnic conflict before it starts. How does he do it? By meeting parties behind closed doors. Silence, discretion, impartiality. These are his watchwords. But why should anyone want to listen to him? What carrots can he offer? And what sticks? When I met van der Stoel, that's what I wanted to know.
In my line of work, no news is good news. Preventive diplomacy is seldom discussed in the popular press. If a crisis is averted, especially at an early stage, nothing newsworthy has occurred. And yet, for the people involved, this is the best possible outcome. The logic of preventive diplomacy is simple. Timely and effective action can help to avert a costly crisis. However, this logic is often not applied. Action is usually only in reaction to what is on the screen in front of us, and by then it is often too late. We are now pouring millions of euros into Southeast Europe. Would not a fraction of these resources and efforts invested at an earlier stage have helped to prevent the malaise that we now find ourselves in? As the old saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
As I listen to you, I see you as a member of a certain kind of generation of people trained in the Cold War era, who believe in quiet diplomacy, who believe in being very gentle with states. But that style of diplomacy may be very, very out of sync with the 1990s. We now have megaphone diplomacy. We now have television diplomacy. We now have public diplomacy. We now have human rights activists coming up and naming and shaming governments. I mean, do you sometimes feel at your age that you've kind of arrived from Mars in a noisy diplomatic world that you no longer understand? I mean, do you feel out of sync with the way diplomacy is now done?
No, because it sounds perhaps a bit arrogant, but I think what I'm trying to do is not just quiet diplomacy, but quiet diplomacy plus. I mean that I'm not just quiet, but also I'm trying, if I really meet complete resistance to my ideas or to my recommendations, to mobilize other states in an effort to convince the state which shows it's to be obstinate to change its ways.
So you come into situations where people have got their backs turned to each other. Sometimes it's the state got its back turned, sometimes it's the minority, sometimes it's both of them. I mean, what carrots and sticks do you have to get them to turn around? Something very mysterious happens. You go into a room, you shut the door, and you come out, and sometimes people are talking to each other. I don't understand what incentives you have and penalties you have to get them to do that.
What I try to explain is that it is in the interest of minority and majority alike to work out the modus vivendi, and that they will both profit when they do this. If, on the other hand, for instance, the government is not showing sufficient interest in the questions which are dear to the minorities, then I certainly try to indicate to the OSCE states that it would be very welcome on my part if they would join my efforts to try to convince that government to take a different line.
Taksi, Vukovar, noćas mora past, idemo dalje.
The whole world looks at the devastation of what was once Yugoslavia with a mixture of shame and surprise. In 1991, Vukovar became the first Yugoslav city to be totally destroyed. Thousands of inhabitants were killed. When the Serbs captured the city, all remaining Croats had to leave. The question of whether this could have been prevented led in 1992 to the creation of a High Commissioner on National Minorities in Europe. His job? To warn against and, if possible, prevent ethnic tensions which could lead to bloody conflicts like Yugoslavia.
We thought that we had secured a permanent, peaceful Europe after the collapse of communism. Well, how can we see to it that such scenes will not occur again? This Yugoslav conflict was the first major armed conflict in Europe since 1945. I think this town of Vukovar ought to remind us about the need to give absolute priority to conflict prevention activities.
It's January 1997 and the High Commissioner still has 6 months left to mediate before Eastern Slavonia and its capital Vukovar are back under Croatian rule. Tens of thousands of Croatian refugees will be returning. The United Nations fear there will be acts of revenge against the Serbs who've occupied the area for the past 5 years. At the same time, the UN fear that the Serbs will be prevented from returning to their former homes in Croatia. Somehow, Van der Stoel has to find a way to get both communities to live together again.
What the future will be.
Potpredsjednik vlade i ministar vanjskih poslova dr. Mate Granić razgovarao je s visokim povjerenikom OESS-a za nacionalne manjine Maxom van der Stoelom.
Pismo o namjerama hrvatske vlade, predstojeći izbori u Hrvatskom Podunavlju i stanje nakon odlaska UNTS-a teme su o kojima su razgovarali potpredsjednik vlade dr. Ivica Kostović i visoki povjerenik OESS-a za nacionalne manjine Max van der Stoel.
Am I right in thinking that you've tried very hard to make sure that the Serb minority can return to Croatian territory and that you have tried to get the Croatian government to accord that Serb minority rights and also provide them housing and things, and that I get the impression that your efforts have not been noticeably successful.
I still see insufficient willingness really to assure return on big scale. And I also have to notice that more and more Serbs are still leaving Eastern Slavonia, even Serbs who lived there before the war started in 91. And
this is quiet ethnic cleansing, is it not?
I don't contradict you. That is indeed very serious. I have recently, I have again, and that was, I think, the last in a succession of meetings and of letters I sent. I have sent a letter to Foreign Minister Granic to express my deep concern about this. I must say that I found the answer disappointing. And I still, there's not a day passes, more Serbs are leaving the area.
If the answers of the Croatian government are unsatisfactory, as they appear to be, what can you do?
Well, I can, and I have of course done this, I can draw the attention of the Permanent Council to it, but still it sticks to this policy.
But doesn't it follow from what you're saying that the sanction you've got is basically, if you don't clean up your act in this area, there's absolutely no prospect of you gaining admission to the European Union? Isn't that the essential sanction that you and the OSCE have in this regard?
Well, I think it must be clear to them that this will be the consequence.
Is it clear to them?
Well, I think they must have been rather deaf if they haven't understood this message. Of course, I cannot state on behalf of the European Union on the Croatian policies on the one hand, and the existence of certain standards, political standards, before which have to be respected before a country can be admitted, must make it clear to the government that the chances of coming closer to Europe remain extremely slim.
Wenders gets results by being persistent and by being there. He's on the road more than 150 days a year, and he's been keeping up this pace for 7 years. Wherever minorities are in danger, the Hungarian minority in Slovakia, the Albanian minority in Macedonia and Kosovo, and the Russian minority in the 3 Baltic states. Here in Latvia, Wenders has visited more than 20 times, keeping the Russian minority talking to the Latvian government and persuading the government to alter its language and nationality laws to protect the Russian minority. Why do the Baltic states listen? Because they know that conforming to European human rights standards may make the difference between getting into the European Union or remaining on the outside.
President, how do you do? Okay. Thank you.
The Baltic states are proud. They're small nations, but they're proud nations, proud of their independence, proud of their traditions. You don't just go to these governments and say, be nice to your minorities. You actually, and your office gets hands-on involvement in the drafting of legislation in respect of minority language rights, minority education rights. You're right into the engine room of these people's constitutions. At what point do they say to you, Mr. van der Stoel, you're a very nice Dutch gentleman, but what the hell business do you have interfering in our country, in our constitution, in our laws?
Well, there are certainly some voices which make express this sentiment in a very convincing way. But there is something which is too often forgotten. And there is, in the OSCE, we have all agreed to one basic concept. We did so at the Human Dimension Conference in Moscow in '91. That when it comes to human rights and minority rights, this is not a question which is only of interest to the country concerned, but that is also very much a matter which is of interest to the community of OSCE states. In other words, it is impossible for any state member of the OSCE to say, well, there is outside interference. In effect, by joining the OSCE, they have accepted that OSCE organs can be involved in internal matters when it comes to human rights.
Does that mean that OSCE membership, they surrender some portion of their sovereignty?
Yes, perhaps they have not realized it when they accepted this obligation, but it is certainly there in no uncertain terms. This is a matter of concern, not just for the state alone, it's just as much a matter of concern for the community of OSCE states. I have indicated. But I do think that we, the international community, didn't try hard enough. And that also for a long time we followed the policy of illusions. Rugova, who would see to it that shot would never be fired, while developments pointed in the other direction.
But isn't there another problem, which is that you talk as if the international community spoke with one voice, but the international community didn't speak with one voice. The international community didn't necessarily support you as the lead interlocutor in preventive diplomacy, for example.
Yes, it is true. There were various different voices, different opinions. But I also think that there was another factor. Simply, there was a reluctance to get too far involved. What will that mean in consequences? What will be the consequences? What will be the financial sacrifices we have to? All these things made governments to decide to close their eyes and just to put the problem not on the front burner, but on the back burner, until it was too late. Again, you might be right. The problem might not have been possible, conflict prevention, but certainly more efforts ought to have been made earlier.
But isn't that, in a sense, the counsel of perfection? Problems are on a politician's back burner until they turn urgent. In international affairs, that means they're on the back burner until they turn violent. Isn't it simply always going to be the case that the international community will not turn to basic problems, human rights violations, until they turn to violence? Isn't that the essential frustration of the kind of work you're trying to do?
Well, I think, unfortunately, yes, this has been the practice so far. But considering the consequences of armed conflict, is not time that we ought to start a serious debate on changing our ways here. I really do think that there is a lot of talk about conflict prevention, but so far there has been far too little effort really to make conflict prevention work.
One way of looking at your job is to say that you're what used to be called in the 19th century the canary in the mine. That is, you're the little bird that falls over when there's dangerous gases. Now, when the canary looks out of its cage and you look at your area, your mandate area, where are the danger spots, the really active inflammatory danger spots that you want to warn the world about right now in October 1999 as your mandate comes to an end? Where are the danger spots that worry you most?
One of my concerns is Macedonia. The big problem there is that there are in fact two peoples living together but having very, very few social contacts. So there are just two worlds in one state, Albanians and Macedonians. And that is the basic problem of Macedonia. What happened in Kosovo cannot fail to have an impact on the Macedonian situation. I think especially...
How do you fear that impact?
The Albanians in Kosovo are in the process of acquiring a lot of rights which Albanians in Macedonia don't have. On the other side, that is an independent Albania. I think it is likely that the Albanians in Macedonia might return to ideas like transforming Macedonia into a confederation of Albanians and Macedonians.
And if they were to do that, that would threaten the integrity of Macedonia as a state.
Yes.
How are you? Good to see you again.
Good to see you. English.
Nice to see you.
I'm very glad to have this opportunity for an exchange of views on the problems of the Roma here. I know there are many. There's the element of discrimination. There are education questions. There is the problem of unemployment. What can be expected in the near future? And also about what possibly the international community could do. All these things I would be highly interested to hear about.
Înțelegem că România trece printr-o perioadă destul de critică din punct de vedere social, economic, dar câteva elemente de bază persistă. Discriminarea, situația socioeconomică a minorității romilor de la zi la zi se degradează și legislația actuală încă nu este adecvată pentru a oferi o siguranță, o certitudine minorităților din România.
There is no doubt that the gypsy populations all over Europe are often very seriously oppressed and have very difficult living conditions. But they don't necessarily constitute a political danger in the sense that they're not likely to overthrow a state. So, because they don't constitute a political danger, what's the rationale for the Minorities Commissioner getting involved in their case?
I think we have to realize is that the Roma problems in the various states become more and more serious. The massive unemployment, the poor education, the discrimination, last but not least, all these things are really have reached the stage where something that has to be done. I don't think that there is the risk of the Roma starting a war against the respective governments. But I do think that if these rapidly expanding populations are not dealt with properly, if they are not involved in the solution of their own problems sufficiently, it could be a factor of destabilization in various countries. The new generation of Romas is now coming up who are not simply prepared any longer to take this laying down. They will be far more offensive in trying to get justice for their people.
Can we move on to another area where you've done some work, and that's Kyrgyzstan? There are a whole bunch of little states in that area of the world. Why Kyrgyzstan? Why have you put so much time into that particular place? Why have they been receptive to what you're doing?
Well, it is not just Kyrgyzstan, it is also Kazakhstan. Because they feel that this would be in their own interest, that only a democratic system will have a future. Not saying that Kyrgyzstan is already a full-blown democracy, but there is the willingness to see how there can be development towards democracy. There is also quite a willingness to consider minority rights. And this, together with a good relationship I have developed with the president, made it possible for us to do some useful work.
Здравствуйте. В эфире новости, подготовленные информационной службой телевидения «Пирамида», в студии Игорь Клевцов. Сегодня президент Кыргызстана Аскар Акаев встретился с Верховным комиссаром ОБСЕ по делам национальных меньшинств господином Максом Вандерстулом, посетившим нашу республику уже в 8-й раз.
На встрече обсуждались вопросы дальнейшего сотрудничества между Управлением Верховного комиссара ОБСЕ и нашей республикой по вопросам межэтнических отношений. В частности, речь шла о создании в Кыргызстане института Омбудсмана, который успешно работает во многих странах мира. Как сказал Верховный комиссар ОБСЕ, этот институт обеспечивает создание равноправных отношений между правительством и гражданами страны. Любой человек, считающий, что со стороны правительства нарушаются его права, может обратиться в этот институт за защитой. Как отметил господин Вендерс, принципиальное согласие Аскара Акаева и кыргызского правительства на создание такой структуры в нашей республике было получено.
Mr. Chairman, I should like to report on my various activities since I last addressed the Council. I should like to start off by referring to my visit to Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. In Kyrgyzstan, I addressed the Assembly of the Peoples of Kyrgyzstan on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of this organization, which deals with interesting issues. On that same occasion, President Akayev announced that he had decided, in conformity with my recommendations, to establish the institution of an independent ombudsman for human and ethnic rights. Mr. Chairman, I now come to Estonia. In recent weeks, I exchanged letters with Foreign Minister Ilves regarding the state language law. This correspondence will be distributed soon to delegations.
One way I might understand what you're doing would be as follows, that the OSCE and your office is the kind of gatekeeper to Europe. You set the criteria for coming into Europe for these new states that have been created since the end of the Cold War. You know, the Baltic states, Croatia, Slovakia, places where you've been active. And basically what you do is you go in there and you say, listen, guys, if you want to join the European community eventually, there's certain rules of the road, certain rules about minority rights guarantees specifically. And the basic power you have is as the gatekeeper. Be fair, that's the basic stick. If you play ball
the question whether certain political standards which have been formulated by the European Union are being respected. And I certainly do try to various
this and that group or this and that government. I said, you stick to your line, because if you believe that that's the right thing and I have supported you, and I will support you to the end on the line you have taken. That's sort of characteristic that Mr. van der Stoel has shown in everything that I have seen him doing.
It can be rather costly to work with conflict prevention, but if you compare the costs for prevention with the costs for example, the Kosovo war, $800 million a day, it's a huge sum of money which are used for conflict when it's military, and therefore I think we should try to use more of the money for conflict prevention. The idea of having a special person working with minority conflicts is very essential, and I think the work Max van der Stoel has been doing has been very important. It will be as important coming years in Europe. I think he has done an excellent work, and I think we should continue in the same direction as he started out. I think that is very, very important.
Je pense qu'il est un homme de grande conviction. Un homme qui croit dans la justice et qui croit aussi dans l'homme. Il est un humaniste aussi, une personnalité qui a des convictions, des idéaux, et qu'il pense qu'il est possible de transformer l'humanité pour le meilleur. Je l'ai vu aussi de bicyclette à La Haye. Il se promenait, non, il allait pour son ministère de bicyclette toujours. Et nous avons fait une grande amitié. J'ai une grande admiration pour la personnalité de Max van der Stoel. Il est un homme simple, un homme direct, un homme très intelligent, très consciencieux, avec un grand sens de la justice et de l'équité.
He was ingrained in my mind and I would say in the mind of the Greek people during the dictatorship as one of the basic fighters for freedom and for democracy in Greece. And he fought very strongly in the Council of Europe then to get the condemnation of Greece because of its violations of human rights and torture. And he developed a close relationship with my father.
If you had to look yourself in the mirror, what aspects of your own temperament helped you in your job? What aspects of your temperament held you back in your job?
What helped me is that I don't give up so easily. If I fail, I always try again. And to try again, as I really think is essential. What might be have been a drawback, perhaps that I don't have a proper sense for publicity, apparently. In the sense, not so much to sell my own personality, but to ensure more attention for the work of my office. That might have helped to overcome specific problems of growth of the office. So that is a self-criticism I'm making, apart from other things. Perhaps sometimes I ask a bit too much from my collaborators.
If he decides that there is a situation in which he has to be involved, the first and most important thing is that he has to know everything about this situation. Everything about the players, everything about the background, the history, the current developments, the positions of the key players of the neighboring countries. And knowing him as a perfectionist, you can imagine what amount of work you have to do. One thing Wenders hates is to wait or to face unnecessary delays. We had a colleague who, on his first trip with the commissioner, decided to go there well prepared. And he showed up here in the office prior to departure with several suitcases. Mr. Wenders appeared, as usual, with his roll-on, roll-in bag, looked at the suitcases and said, "Oh, what are these suitcases for? You're moving from your house to another house, or you're changing houses, etc. And you leave them here in the office because we have to leave in 10 minutes. So in 10 minutes, our colleague managed to pack the really very necessary things in a very small bag and followed Wenders.
When I look at your job, I think it's an interesting job, but there are an awful lot of nights in cockroach-filled hotels. I mean, it's very, very hard. What drives you? What keeps you at it? Beyond a Protestant sense of duty. You said that one of the things that motivated you deeply was the Dutch experience under Nazi occupation. I'm not sure I understand exactly what that means. It was a terrible time for your people, but what did you personally experience that kind of put the iron in your soul, as we say in English, on the human rights issue?
Well, I think to see a whole people which was free, just being reduced to being slaves. Just the people in control, the Nazis in control, could do with the whole people the way anything they wanted to do. Deport them, kill them, take them hostage. That experience. But I have to add that post-war experience also have contributed to my strong attachment to human rights. That is, I saw the destruction of democracy in Czechoslovakia in '48. There was a clear democratic tradition in Czechoslovakia, and that was all destroyed within a year. That experience that even so, the democracy had a firm basis. It could so easily be undermined from inside.
But doesn't that give you a feeling that human rights are never secure, that institutions are never as stable as they seem?
Yes, indeed. I think the price of liberty is constant vigilance, but the same applies to human rights. If one wants to maintain human rights, to secure human rights, we have always to be on our guard.
Most of your action is in the capitals with the political leaders. How much of your action is with ordinary people?
The frank answer is there is not enough of that. Of course, there are some contacts, but it's mainly done with leaders of organizations, of minorities, and this kind of thing. Just to speak with ordinary people, I simply haven't enough time to do this. But it is a weak spot. I certainly ought to have to do this more.
Is it possible that you're just personally more comfortable with political leaders, responsible officials like yourself, than you are with ordinary people?
Of course, there is a sort of diplomatic language with which the ordinary people are not familiar, but that makes them so interesting. So no, it is not that. It is simply that is constantly I have to to choose priorities. Who do I have to see anyway? And indeed, then just a talk with the ordinary man in the street is then often the victim.
She asked, what's the solution?
Yes, I certainly, I cannot, unfortunately, I cannot offer you a
Gospodin
solution.
vam ne može ponuditi konkretno rješenje.
I'm going to discuss what kind of solutions can be found.
Ali će razgovarati o tome kakvo se rješenje može naći.
On će razgovarati. I to, hoće to biti brzo, to rješenje.
Citizens of Croatia have to be treated equally whether they are Serbs or whether they are Croats.
Svi stanovnici u Hrvatskoj moraju biti tretirani jednako, bez obzira jesu Hrvati po nacionalnosti ili Srbi.
To štima, pa mi se ne borimo za to.
That's okay.
Pa mi da to, i trebalo da to bude tako opet.
That should be.
Da opet živimo kao što smo živjeli.
To live as they lived in the past.
Well, okay.
Hoćete jabuka da idemo na...
Hello. Welcome to Bra.
Welcome to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Van der Stoel is an old friend of Václav Havel. He came to Prague in 1977 and was the first Western foreign minister to meet members of the dissident Charter 77 movement. 20 years later, they're in power, but they remember, and so does Van der Stoel.
Tak já bych rád pana Van der Stoela přivítal na Pražském hradě jakožto našeho dávného přítele. Nejen já, ale mnoho lidí nezapomíná na vaše angažmá v dobách nesvobody. Konkrétně by mě zajímala jedna věc. Ta hantýrka jejich zahraničně politická, ukazuje na Martina, ta jejich hantýrka užívá pojmu tichá diplomacie v souvislosti s OBSE i s vaší prací. Mě by zajímalo, co to přesně je a jak to probíhá.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your kind words of welcome. In effect, yes, when one tries to get involved in the early stage of what could become a conflict, to work behind the scenes to see what are really the difficult points where there might be a possibility for any of the parties to show some more flexibility.
One of the things that's unusual about you is that most Western politicians, foreign ministers, during the 70s simply took the Cold War panorama for granted. I mean, assumed it would go on forever. And you didn't in one respect, which is that you opened up relations very early with Charter 77 and the Czech dissidents. Why did you do that, and why did you see that that was the way to the future?
Well, just before visiting Czechoslovakia in the midst of the Cold War, that was then a custom for Western European foreign minister to do. I noticed the creation of Charter 77. I didn't dare to take up contact with them on my part, because I felt that they had to decide whether they could take the risk. But when a representative of Gata 77 came to my hotel and wanted to talk, I decided to do so. That infuriated the Czech government, but fortunately it opened the way for further meetings like these. And
who was that representative?
That was Professor Patočka. I must say...
Great figure, great man.
A great man. But what happened a few days later was very tragic, and I felt very, very bad about this. He was interrogated for about 8 or 9 hours. He had a weak heart, and a few hours later he was dead.
Did you feel a sense of responsibility that you'd taken an important step and put a good man in danger as a result?
Yes, that is my feeling. I must say that when I spoke with the Gata people later on this, I said Patočka wouldn't have wanted anything else. He really wanted to convey the message.
It's clear that the memory of him moves you. Has your contact with those kind of people helped your subsequent contact with the Havel generation and with the people in power in Czechoslovakia now?
Yes, I traveled again to the Czech Republic. In '88, I was witnessing the arrest of Havel before my eyes. He had organized a conference and had invited me to participate. So that created also a special bond.
Can you explain why it is that you took this particular attitude towards Eastern European dissidents at a time, as I say, when most Western European politicians took the Cold War division of Europe for granted and accepted that, you know, domestic dissent in Eastern European countries was a matter for those states and not for Western European intervention? Why did you take that?
I was at this Helsinki 1975 conference. There we adopted a wonderful declaration on human rights and human rights principles. And then people trying to defend the same principles and not to receive them, I think it was simply, I would have felt ashamed to let them wait at the door.
It was a matter of moral consistency.
One can call it that, yes.
In December, the silent diplomat leaves his post after 7 years. He hasn't won them all, because when people want to fight, he can't stop them. But when they do want to pull back from the brink, he's been there.
Two things have always fascinated me, even when I was a young boy. That is human rights and how to maintain peace. These two interests somehow meet each other in this job. This made it such a fascinating job for me. I really feel that these 7 years might have been exhausting years, but it certainly were extremely fascinating years.
Mi smo toliko zadovoljni, kaj da se naša familija. Zadovoljni smo sa svemu što je došao i